The darkness before medieval English dawn carries a quality that is difficult to recover now, even in imagination. There are no lights bleeding through curtains from the street outside, no distant motorway hum, no quiet glow of electronics in the corner of the room. In a 13th century village somewhere in the English Midlands, darkness is simply darkness, deep and complete, as total as anything this side of closing one's eyes. And inside one of the low thatched cottages that press close around a village green, a man has already come awake. His name, for our purposes, is Thomas. He is 32 years old, which means he is not young in a world where 35 or 40 was a reasonable end point for a working body that had never known anything other than work. His back has troubled him since his early 20s. His hands, even in summer, carry a roughness and an ingrained darkness in the creases that no amount of washing quite removes. He lies for a moment on the straw pallet that serves him as a bed, breathing quietly, listening to the breathing of his family around him. His wife Agnes, 2 children who have survived their dangerous first years, and a dog that sleeps near the cold hearth because the nights are cold and because working dogs on the edges of survival are sometimes permitted small comforts that pure principle might not allow. He does not think of himself as a historical subject. He has no sense that people centuries from now will find his life worth examining, worth reconstructing, worth the hours of patient attention that scholars will eventually give to manor court rolls and tide surveys and the slow archaeology of ridge and furrow fields. He is simply a man who is awake and who must now arise, because the fields do not wait, and the animals do not wait, and the morning does not wait. And this is simply what a morning is. The room in which he lies is small, even by the standards of small. The ceiling is low enough that a man of average height can nearly touch the rafters when he stands. The walls are timber and wattle and daub, a mixture of straw and clay and animal dung packed between a lattice framework of flexible branches, then smooth over on the exterior, and they hold out the cold reasonably well, though not perfectly. And in certain places near the door where the ceiling has loosened, the morning air comes like a slow, cool exhalation. The floor is beaten earth, tamped hard over years of use. In summer, dried herbs might be scattered across it, meadowsweet, perhaps, or strewing rushes brought up from the stream, partly for fragrance and partly because it was believed they discouraged fleas, which were an ever-present feature of life in close proximity to animals and other human beings. Tonight the floor is bare. It is February or somewhere near it, and luxuries are seasonal. There is no chimney. The fire that warmed the household yesterday evening burned in a central hearth, a shallow pit or raised stone platform near the middle of the room. And smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof, or through gaps in the thatch, or sometimes simply did not find its way out at all, and hung in a permanent low haze that darkened the rafters and settled gently on every surface, including the lungs of the people inside. The beams are black with years of it. The smell of old smoke and damp wool and animal warmth is so much the smell of home that Thomas no longer notices it all. It is simply the smell of being inside, the smell of being sheltered, which on a February morning is something very close to the smell of safety. He pulls on his outer tunic and his hose and his rough leather shoes and lifts the wooden bar that secures the door and steps outside. The cold is immediate and complete. February in central England is not the very coldest it gets. That is January's work. But it is a cold that has settled so long into the ground and the air and the thatch and the wood of every gate that it has begun to feel structural, like something load-bearing. The sky overhead is the deep gray blue of pre-dawn, lightening fractionally to the east. There is frost on the ground, not the thick, crunching frost of deep winter, but a thin, pale skin of it on the common yard and on the thatch of the house across the way, where it catches the first faint suggestion of light and holds a momentary shimmer before the morning takes it. He stands for a moment outside his door, letting his eyes adjust to even this partial dark. Around him, the village is beginning its quiet return to itself. A woman from the household to his left, let us call her Margaret, who has been his neighbor for all the years either of them can remember, appears in her own doorway with a wooden pail, heading in the direction of the stream. Smoke had begun to rise, thin and perfectly straight in the still air, from 2 or 3 of the nearer rooftops. Somewhere in the common, a cow lows from the direction of the church. A rook calls once and falls silent. This is a village at its quietest, its most essential. Perhaps 30 households clustered around a central green, their houses pressing close as if for warmth, the lanes between them worn to bare earth by centuries of feet and hooves. The village green itself is not the picturesque, carefully tended swore of a later imagination. It is a rough, trampled, practical space, the kind of place where animals can be penned at night and wagons can be turned and people can gather when gathering is necessary. Around its edges, the houses sit with their doors facing inward toward the common space, their backs turned to the fields, which is not only a practical arrangement against the wind, but gives the village its feeling of being a thing that faces itself, a community turned inward toward its own life. At the eastern edge of the green, the church sits with its squat stone tower, and it is worth pausing here for a moment, because the church is not simply one building among others. It is the only stone building in the village. Stone cost money and required skill and was, in most of rural England in this period, beyond the reach of any individual household. The church's walls, thick, solid, built to last, already lasting, make it unlike everything else here a way that was not accidental. The permanence of stone was a message. It said, this endures. It said, this is the axis around which everything else turns. The church of this village will still be standing, more or less intact, in 500 years, long after every one of the wattle and daub houses around it has dissolved back into ground from which it was made. The church bell, too, shapes the day in ways that might seem invisible until you try to imagine the day without it. In a world with no clocks, no household timepieces, no watches, no way for a working person to check the hour except by the sun, which is itself unreliable in the gray English winter, the bell is the organizing principle of time. It marks the canonical hours of the church's daily cycle, matins and lauds in the deep night, prime at dawn, terce at mid-morning, sex at noon, none in the early afternoon, vespers at evening, compline at the day's end. Not every village church rang all of these on every day, but the broad shape of the day was communicated by bells. And in a community where everyone was listening for the same sound, the bell was something like a shared heartbeat, the pulse of collective life. Beyond the houses, visible even in this low light as a series of long, parallel shadows running roughly east to west across the rising ground, are the fields. Not one field but three, in the arrangement that had become standard across much of lowland England over the preceding centuries. One sown in autumn with wheat or rye, one to be planted in spring with oats or barley or peas or beans, and one left fallow through the full cycle of the year, empty and resting, returned to itself so that whatever thin fertility it possessed could gather again before the plow turned it next season. This three-field system was not the invention of any single mind or the decree of any single lord. It evolved gradually, as communities discovered by long and sometimes painful trial that rotating crops through different fields prevented the most severe forms of soil exhaustion and gave the village a fighting chance of feeding itself year after year. It was conservative and inflexible and deeply resistant to individual improvisation, and in its own terms, reasonably effective. The land within those three fields was divided among the village households in long, narrow strips, a furlong in length roughly, the distance a team of oxen could plow before needing to turn, which is where that word comes from, out of the Old English for furlong. Thomas holds perhaps 30 acres in total, scattered across perhaps 50 or 60 individual strips, interleaved with the holdings of his neighbors in a complex patchwork, so that no single family controlled all the best land or all the worst. Some of his strips lie on the good dark soil near the stream, where the drainage is reasonable and the crops come in reliably. Others lie on the thinner, stonier ground at the far edge of the north field, where in a dry summer the grain comes up short and pale. This distribution was not perfect justice. Better connected families held more of the good ground, but it had a logic to it. A logic of shared fate, of distributed risk, of the understanding that no one in this village would prosper entirely alone, and no one would fail entirely alone either. Beyond the arable fields, at their margins and in the hollows between them, lies the common, the shared heath and rough pasture and scrubby woodland that belongs to the village collectively rather than to any individual household. The common is not wasted land, whatever it might look like. It is essential. This is where the village livestock graze through the spring and summer on the rights that each household holds according to its standing. The right to put a certain number of cattle or sheep on the common, which is a right carefully managed to prevent overgrazing by those with more animals than their fair share. In autumn, pigs are driven into the woodland fringe for pannage, fattening on fallen acorns and beechnuts before the pre-winter slaughter. Villagers gather fallen wood here, and bracken for bedding, and in certain seasons particular plants for particular purposes. The common is not luxurious, but it is a resource, and its loss, when it came in later centuries through enclosure, would be felt as a genuine wound in communities like this one. Up the low slope above all of this, visible from almost anywhere in the village on a clear day, the manor house sits among its outbuildings. The lord of this particular manor is not a great nobleman. This is not a story of great noblemen who exist somewhere higher up in the layered world of medieval England, receiving deference from men who then receive deference from men below them. The lord here is a knight, or perhaps a lesser landowner, a man of some local authority and limited reach whose world does not extend much beyond this valley, and 2 or 3 neighboring villages he also holds. His house has a proper hall, and separate sleeping quarters and a kitchen set slightly apart from the main building to reduce the risk of fire spreading. He has his own walled garden, his own dovecot, his own chapel. And surrounding his house, the domain land, the portion he farms for his own profit, rather than letting the villagers, lies in its own fields, worked partly by the labor of the people below. It is this obligation, the labor owed for the land held, that is perhaps the most defining fact of Thomas's life, the weight he carries without quite feeling it as a weight because he has never known anything else. He holds his strips not as a free man holds property, but as a villain, a serf, under the authority of the lord of the manor, and in exchange for that holding he owes the lord labor, 2 or 3 days of work per week through the ordinary year, more during the vital seasons of plowing and harvest, when every hand was needed on the domain fields before the lord's crops were seen to. He cannot leave the village without the Lord's permission. His children will inherit his condition. If his daughter marries a man from another manor, he must pay a fee for the privilege. When he dies, the Lord's reeve will arrive and take the best animal from the household, the Harriet, as it was called, the death duty that followed a villain even into the grave. We will return all of this in time, because these obligations deserve to be understood fully, not just catalogued. For now, it is enough to feel the general shape of them, the way they surround a life like Thomas is the way the horizons surround a landscape, always present, always there at the edge of everything, defining the space in which all the rest of life happened. Down near the mill, the stream moves steadily in its course, indifferent to the morning. The mill itself is the Lord's mill, like the mill in nearly every English village of this era, which means that when Thomas has grain to grind, he must bring it there and pay for the grinding and flour taken directly from his measure. He cannot grind elsewhere, cannot build his own mill, cannot escape the toll attached to the monopoly. The miller, as a result, occupied an interesting position in the village, not quite one of the peasants, not aligned with the Lord exactly either, but the keeper of a choke point through which everyone's food passed at least once, and widely and perhaps not entirely fairly suspected of cheating on the weights. Whether any particular miller actually cheated is largely lost on us. What the suspicion tells us is something about how people felt when power of that quiet, daily kind was exercised over necessities of life. But the mill is quiet now, and the day is merely beginning. Thomas turns and goes back inside, where Agnes has already coaxed the embers to life and hung the pot, the same pot, its iron sides dark with years of use, over the rekindled flame. The pottage from last night is still there, thick with grain and winter root vegetables, and it will be breakfast and probably midday as well. He eats standing up, because there is not much time, and because the cold from outside is still in his clothes, and because this is simply how mornings go. Outside, the light is coming now, properly coming, the sky above the eastern fields turning from gray-blue to a pale, wintry cream at the horizon. The frost on the thatch is beginning to let go. The village is filling with its ordinary sounds, a child's voice, the clank of a pail against a doorframe, the low conversation of 2 men who have met in the lane and are speaking about something neither of them will remember by afternoon. Smoke from a dozen rooftops rises straight and slow into the still air, and the long fields beyond the houses are becoming visible in their full extent, the ridge and furrow of them running out to the tree line in the distance. Thomas steps back outside. He has a long day ahead of him on the domain, plowing work that cannot be delayed regardless of the cold, and the oxen will need to be fetched from the common and harnessed before morning is much further along. He pauses for just a moment on his threshold, not from sentimentality, which is not quite what the moment is, but simply from the ordinary brief pause of a man whose body already knows what is coming and is taking one last quiet breath before it does. The same smoke from the same low rooftops, the same gray cream light over the same fields, the same sound of water over stones somewhere below. A world so settled into itself that it feels less like a moment in time than like a condition of the earth. This is the village at the edge of everything. This is where we begin. There's a word that appears again and again in the manor court rolls of medieval England, in the careful Latin of clerks who recorded, season after season, the details of village life with the patient thoroughness of people who understood that what was written down had legal weight and what was not written down did not. The word is villainous. It gives us, eventually, our word villain, which tells you something about how history travels and what it loses along the way. A villainous was, in the original sense, simply a person of the villa, the estate, the agricultural settlement. It carried no inherent moral judgment. But by the 13th century, the period we are visiting, the word had accumulated something heavier, a legal meaning, a status, a precise position within a hierarchy of rights and obligations that the law of medieval England had spent generations defining with a care that might seem, to us, almost obsessive, were it not for the fact that so much depended on it for so many people. To be a villain, the English form of the word, was to occupy a particular place in the world, and that place had walls. Thomas, waking in his cottage before the February dawn, is a villain. His father was a villain before him, and his father's father before that, in an inheritance of status that passed to the male line as reliably as eye color, and sometimes to the female line too, depending on particular customs of a particular manner. He did not choose this. It was a condition into which he was born, as fixed and unchosen as the shape of his hands or the color of the local stone. And yet it would be a mistake to speak of it as a condition without texture or variation, as though the word villain described a single, uniform experience. It did not. Medieval serfdom in England was complicated, locally inflected, and in practice shot through a nuance that the clean lines of legal theory rarely captured. What the law said a villain was, and what life as a villain actually contained, were two overlapping but not identical things. What the law said, in its sharpest formulation, was this: a villain owned nothing outright that his lord could not, in theory, take. The phrase that appears in legal texts of the period is memorable in its bluntness. A villain was to hold all his goods at the will of his lord, not as a practical statement of what lords actually did day to day in the ordinary run of village life. Most lords were not in the business of stripping their tenants of everything they owned, since a tenant who owned nothing could render no service and pay no dues, and was therefore useless. But as a legal principle, a statement of what the relationship fundamentally was. The villain's holding his strips in the open fields, his house, his animals, his tools. All of these were held at the Lord's will, in the Lord's name, on the Lord's terms. This mattered in ways both practical and profound. It mattered practically because it meant a villain could not take his lord to the royal courts to defend his property. If the lord decided to increase the labor services owed, or to seize back a piece of land, or demand some new and previously unheard of payment, the villain had no recourse in the king's justice, which was available to free men but not, in these matters, to serfs. His only protection was the custom of the manor, the accumulated practice and precedent of how things have been done in this particular place over preceding generations, recorded in the manor court rolls, and enforced, unevenly, imperfectly, but with some genuine force, by the community itself, which had a collective memory and a collective interest in preserving what had always been. Custom was not nothing. In practice, it was quite a lot. But it was different from law, more fragile, dependent on continuity and on lords who chose to respect it, which many did and some did not. The obligations attached to villanage were specified with some care. Week work was a cornerstone. 2 or 3 days of labor per week, sometimes more, on the lord's domain. This meant plowing the lord's field with the same ox team that had to plow one's own strips, at the lord's priority and the lord's scheduling, which in practice meant that when the season demanded both, it was the lord's work that came first and one's own that waited. In addition to week work, there were boon works, special additional labor services demanded at the busiest points of the agricultural year, especially harvest, when the lord's grain needed to be cut and carted and stored before the weather could turn. On boon work days, a larger number of workers would descend on the domain than on ordinary week work days, and the Lord was expected to provide food, bread and ale at minimum, sometimes more, as part of the arrangement, which gave the occasion a slightly different quality, almost festive in its way. A mass of bodies working in the same direction toward the same visible goal, the grain coming off the fields and rising in the barn. Beyond the labor, there were payments. The tallage was a periodic levy the Lord could impose on his villain tenants at his discretion, not arbitrarily in practice, because the custom of the manor constrained even this, but in principle a payment whose exact amount and timing was at the Lord's determination. The Harriet we have already met, the best animal of the household taken when a villain died. The death duty that ensured the Lord's claim extended even into that most final of transactions. There was the merchet, a payment required when a villain's daughter married, and particularly when she married a man from another manor, because her labor and her children would then be lost to this one. The precise sum varied enormously by place and circumstance, but the principle was consistent. A villain's family was a resource, and its movements required a fee. There was a lerwite imposed on women who became pregnant out of wedlock, which was a fine that sounds punitive but was in some contexts more bureaucratic than moral. The Lord's interest being less in the woman's virtue than the fact that an unmarried pregnant woman had her future options, and thus her future services complicated in ways that required acknowledgement. None of this was administered by the Lord personally in most cases. Between the Lord and the villain stood the reeve, a village man himself, elected or appointed from among the more capable and more trusted of the peasant community, responsible for organizing labor services, collecting dues, maintaining the Lord's property, and appearing before the manor court to account for the management of the domain. The reeve was in an uncomfortable position, which perhaps explains why in nearly every satire and complaint poem of the period the reeve appears as a figure of suspicion. Too close to the Lord to be fully trusted by the village, not close enough to the Lord to be fully trusted by the Lord, navigating between two worlds with the careful footwork of someone who knew the ground on both sides was unreliable. Geoffrey Chaucer's reeve, in the Canterbury Tales, that lean, choleric man on his gray horse, is drawing on a recognizable type, one that his audience would have encountered in life as well as literature. The manor court itself deserves a moment, because it was the institution through which most of the formal business of peasant life was conducted and recorded, and through which historians centuries later can actually hear, faintly and incompletely, something like the voices of the people inside. The court met periodically, several times a year in most manors, and handled an enormous range of matters: transfers of land between villain families, enforcement of labor obligations, punishment of minor offenses, resolution of disputes between neighbors over field boundaries or water rights, or the damage done by someone's pig to someone else's crop. The proceedings were conducted largely in English and recorded in Latin, and the records that survive are among the most intimate documents we have of medieval village life, because they capture specifics, names, relationships, the exact nature of grievances, in a way that more formal sources rarely do. Reading through a set of manor court rolls is to encounter a world that is simultaneously familiar and remote. A man is fined for allowing his animals to stray into a neighbor's grain. A woman is recorded as having taken in a lodger without the Lord's permission, because even this, the decision to share one's own household with another person, required approval in the thicket of obligations surrounding villain status. Two brothers are in dispute over the division of their father's holding. Someone has failed to repair the section of fence that is their responsibility. Someone has brewed ale without paying the size, the fee that covered the right to sell, and will pay for the privilege of having done so. These are small things, domestic things, things that belong to the texture of ordinary life, and their presence in a record is a reminder that behind every line of legal and institutional history, there were people doing the human work of negotiating with one another over the necessities of daily existence. There's a version of the story in which the Lord is simply the villain, the dark figure of authority above whose shadow the peasant lives in perpetual dread. And there is another version in which the relationship between Lord and villain is painted as something almost paternalistic, the Lord providing protection and order in exchange for labor, a mutual arrangement serving mutual needs in a dangerous world. Both of these contain something true, and both of them simplify. The relationship was contractual in some ways, coercive in others, shaped by local personality and local custom in ways that made it variable to a degree that neither version quite captures. Some lords were genuinely attentive to the welfare of their villages, not always from altruism, but from the practical understanding that a village full of sick, exhausted, underfed serfs was a village that produced nothing, that rendered no services and paid no dues and let the domain fields go to seed. A villain who could not eat could not work. A holding that was not maintained became worthless. There was therefore a limit, not always observed willingly, but a real limit, to how far a lord could squeeze his tenants before the squeeze became self-defeating. When harvests were bad and villain families were struggling, prudent lords sometimes remitted dues or extended delays in payment, not because they were generous exactly, but because the mathematics of exploitation required that the exploited survive. And there were protections of a kind. The custom of the manor, as we have said, was real. A villain could appeal to the manor court against the clearly illegal actions of even the lord, and in certain circumstances that appeal might be heard and upheld. The church, whatever its other entanglements with the structures of lordship, maintained as a matter of theology that a serf was a full human person with an immortal soul, which did not prevent his earthly exploitation, but at least prevented the slide into the outright chattel slavery that had characterized the ancient world and would characterize parts of the later world. A villain could not be sold apart from his land, which distinguished him legally from a slave in ways that mattered, even if those ways were sometimes more formal than felt. What it actually felt like, from inside, is harder to recover. The documents that survive, the court rolls, the account rolls, the legal treatises, were written by and for people who were not serfs, and the perspective they encode is accordingly that of the administrators and proprietors of the system rather than its subjects. The occasional glimpse we get is indirect. A refusal to perform labor services, recorded in the court roll as a presentment and a fine, tells us that someone resisted, but not what they felt while resisting. A flight from a manor. Villain families sometimes simply left, walking away from their strips and their legal obligations to try for a new life somewhere the Lord's arm could not easily reach, perhaps in town, where the old law held that a serf who lived within the walls for a year and a day could claim freedom. Tells us that the pull of elsewhere was sometimes stronger than the weight of what was left behind. But the thought in the leaving person's mind, the specific mix of fear and hope and grief and determination, is gone. What we can say with some confidence is that the condition of villanage was experienced by those inside it as a fact of nature as much as a fact of law. This is not the same as saying they accepted it passively or without resentment. Court records of refusal and flight demonstrate that resentment was real and acted on. But a system that had existed for generations, that one's parents had lived inside and one's grandparents had lived inside, that was encoded in every institution of one's world, from the church's tithe to the Lord's mill to the shape of the fields themselves. Such a system became part of the weather. It was simply the condition of life. To resist it was possible, but costly and uncertain. To leave it required a courage that most people, with children to feed and strips to work, and neighbors who depended on their labor and animals they could not carry, did not often find. Thomas, at 32, has not thought seriously about leaving. He has heard of men who left. There is a man in a village 2 days' walk to the east whose grandfather was a villain here, it is said, who slipped away in the dark long before Thomas was born and made himself a new life somewhere to the north, in a town where nobody asked too carefully about where a man came from as long as he could work and pay his way. The story has a quality of legend to it by now, the kind of story that sits at the edge of believable, and Thomas does not spend much time with it. He has his strips to work. He has his wife and his children. He has a dog by the cold hearth and the pottage in the pot, and the reeve waiting to discuss this week's work on the domain. He is, in the most technical sense available to medieval English law, not entirely free. And he is, in the fullest human sense, a man with a life. These two things are both true, and they will remain in tension throughout everything that follows, and the tension does not resolve so much as gradually, over generations and upheavals and plagues and rebellions and slow economic shifts, transform into something new, but that is further ahead than we can see from here, in the February cold, with the frost still on the ground and the fields waiting. For now, he pulls on his hat against the morning chill and goes to meet the reeve, and the day closes over him the way days do, quietly, with its full weight, as if it had always been exactly this heavy and always would be. Picture the field just before first light on a morning in late February or early March. The frost not quite gone from the ground, the skies still carrying that pale, water equality. It has an early spring before the sun has fully committed to being warm. Thomas is already there. And so are the oxen, 4 of them massive and slow-breathing. Their breath coming in soft clouds in the cold air. Their hooves leaving dark prints in the frost as they shift and settle in their traces. The plow behind them is heavy, a construction of wood and iron that requires the full weight of a man to guide, and the soil ahead is stubborn, holding the cold in its depths, giving up the blade's passage only reluctantly, in thick, rolling slabs that turn and fall to the side with a sound somewhere between a tear and a sigh. This is where the year begins, in the proper agricultural sense. Not at Christmas, not at the New Year's turning, but here, in the cold mud, when the ground softens enough to break. Everything that will happen between now and the following autumn, every loaf baked, every bowl of pottage, every tax paid and every tithe rendered and every labor service discharged on domain, traces its origin back to this moment, and the ones like it, the plow going into ground and the soil opening and the seed waiting. The 3-field system required plowing at 2 distinct points in a year, and sometimes a third. The winter field, already sown with wheat or rye in the autumn just past, was already growing, its thin green blades just visible if you look closely at the soil, impossibly delicate against the gray of the season. The spring field was what mattered now. This was the second field in the rotation, the one that would be sown in the weeks ahead with oats or barley or peas or beans, or some combination of them, depending on what the household most needed, and what the local tradition and the manor's preferences suggested. And the fallow field, the third field, resting through its full year recovery, might be lightly plowed once or twice during the year to break up weeds and let the air and rain and frost work the soil before it was asked to produce again. That plow was less urgent, but it was not nothing. Nothing in the agricultural year was nothing. To plow what was a genuine skill, and Thomas had grown up understanding it as such. The furrows needed to be straight, not merely for aesthetic reasons, though there was a local pride in clean. Even work that expressed itself in the kind of glances cast across the field and the comments made in the alehouse afterward, but because straight, even furrows drained properly and distributed the soil's preparation evenly and made the subsequent work of sowing and weeding and ultimately harvesting something that could be managed. A badly plowed strip produced a badly seeded strip and a poorly distributed harvest, and less grain in a household than there might have been. And in a world where the margin between enough and not enough was often thin, badly plowed strips were not an abstraction, but a direct consequence for human bodies. The ox team he worked with was not entirely his own. Oxen were expensive to maintain. They ate heavily through the winter when they could not be put to grass, and a full team of 4 or 8 required more hay and fodder than most individual households could reliably produce. In practice, many villages operated on the basis of shared teams, with 2 or 3 families pooling their animals and their equipment for the plowing season, working each other's strips in a cooperative arrangement that the village managed collectively rather than leaving it to individual negotiation. Thomas had 1 ox of his own, a reliable if aging animal called, as oxen were often called in this period, by names that distinguished them from one another for working purposes. Perhaps something in the old tradition of naming the near and far oxen differently, so the plowman's commands reached the right animal. The other 3 were his neighbors and his cousins, and a third belonging to a widower at the village's edge, who contributed the animal in exchange for having his strips plowed as part of the arrangement. The plowman needed at least 1 other person with him, a driver, often a boy or a younger man, who walked to the front of the team and guided the oxen with a long goad, a stick with sharpened iron tip, keeping them straight, keeping them moving at the necessary pace, responding to the terrain ahead before the team reached it. Thomas's older son, at 8 years old, had begun doing this work on their own strips in the last year. Not yet fully capable but learning, accumulating the knowledge in his body that would make him useful first, and then competent, and then skilled as the years went on. The boy's presence in the field was not sentiment. It was economics and inheritance, and the beginning of the transfer that would in time make this strip and this knowledge and this way of being the world his. The plowing of a single acre took most of a day. 30 acres, Thomas's approximate holding, scattered in strips across 2 fields, represented, even under the best conditions, a considerable number of days of work. And those days competed with the week work owed to the Lord, whose domain strips needed plowing on the same seasonal schedule, and whose claim on Thomas's time and his ox took priority when the 2 overlapped. This was the structural friction at the heart of the villain's agricultural year. The Lord's work and the family's work were not separate systems that could be managed in parallel, but a single system with insufficient time and labor to satisfy both comfortably, and it was invariably the family's work that bent to accommodate the Lord's. By April, if the weather had been kind, the spring plowing was done and the sowing was underway. Sowing was broadcast by hand, a motion that was with practice, as natural and rhythmic as walking. The sower moving along the furrows and scattering seed in a wide arc to each side, the goal being an even distribution that avoided both the wastes of seeds falling too close together and the gaps where the soil sat empty and produced nothing. The seed came from the previous year's harvest, kept back at the threshing and stored carefully through the winter, which created its own quiet anxiety. You could not eat everything the harvest produced, because some of it had to be saved for spring, and the calculation of how much to hold back and how much to consume through the cold months was one that a family in Thomas's position made carefully, sometimes desperately, often wrong. After the sowing, the fields needed weeding. This was work that fell partly to women and children, moving through the rows in the long, mild days of May and June, pulling the plants that competed with the grain for light and soil, thistles, docks, corn marigolds, the wild oat that grew among the cultivated oat and was nearly indistinguishable until a critical moment, and which if left in place would reduce the yield and contaminate the seed supply. It was not glamorous work, and it was not finished work. The weeds grew back, as weeds do, and required multiple passes through the season. But it mattered, and everyone knew it mattered. And the field in June with the grain coming up straight and green between clean furrows was something that could produce a specific satisfaction in the people who had made it so. Midsummer brought the haymaking. The meadow land near the stream, the low ground that flooded in winter and grew rich grass through spring, was cut in late June or early July. The hay spread to dry in the sun and turned again before being gathered and stored against the winter, when it would feed the animals that could not go to grass. Haymaking had a particular quality among all the seasonal labors. It was one of the few that regularly produced something like collective good feeling, perhaps because it was done in long summer days rather than cold ones, perhaps because it was work that yielded a visible, immediate, aromatic result. The scent of cut grass dry in the sun being one of those sensory experiences that carries a pleasure independent of the labor attached to it. Even so, it was work, and it needed to be done quickly when the weather allowed, because cut hay left too long and uncertain whether it could spoil, and spoiled hay was a winter of animal suffering translated directly into a spring of human difficulty. And then came harvest. Of all the labors in the medieval agricultural year, harvest was the one that mattered most completely, that concentrated the most effort into the fewest days, that carried the most existential weight. Everything that had been sown and tended and weeded through the preceding months arrived at this single point of conversion, when the grain in the field became the grain in the barn, and the year's fate was settled. In England in the 13th century, the harvest window was narrow and subject to weather in ways that could not be managed or mitigated. Rain at the wrong moment, a week of cold, wet weather in August when the grain was fully grown, but not yet safely cut, could ruin what 6 months of labor had produced. The urgency of harvest, the imperative to cut and cart and store before the weather turned, was the agricultural year's single genuine emergency, the one moment when the calendar stopped presenting choices and simply demanded. For Thomas and everyone like him, harvest meant boon work on the domain first. The Lord's crops had to be seen before anything else, and the whole village turned out for it. Men, women, older children, sometimes even the elderly who could not do heavy cutting but could bind sheaves or carry water. The reeve organized the work, and the Lord, or his steward if the Lord himself was absent, provided food, bread and ale, almost always, and sometimes additional provisions on what were called love boons. The larger gatherings where something closer to festivities surrounded the labor, the communal nature harvest. All these bodies in the same field, the rhythm of cutting and binding and carting finding its own pace, people working together at something that mattered to all of them, gave it a texture that the ordinary week work did not quite have. It was still labor owed under compulsion. It was still work that came before one's own crops. But the fact of doing it together, and the fact that what was being gathered was visible and concrete and abundant in a good year, gave harvest days something that the rest of the year's toil mostly lacked. After the domain, Thomas's own strips. He and Agnes and the children, and any neighbor willing to help in exchange for a help return would have worked from first light to last light in the short window available. Cutting the ripe grain with a sickle, the scythe was used for hay. The sickle for grain, a distinction that had to do with the height of the crop and the way it needed to be gathered, bending and cutting and gathering and binding into sheaves and stacking those sheaves into sticks to dry in the field before carting. The posture required, bent low over the grain for hours without pause, is one that could be felt in the lower back within the first morning and could not be straightened out by evening and could, over the years and decade of harvest, reshape a body silhouette permanently. Men and women who had spent their working lives in this posture often showed it in later life in the curve of the spine. The forward lean even when standing, the body having adapted structurally to the demands placed on it for so long that the adaptation outlasted the labor. After the harvest, gleaning. The poor of the village, widows, the elderly, families whose strips had produced little, had the customary right to enter the harvested field and gather whatever the reaping had left behind. Fallen ears, overlooked corners, the thin volunteer grain growing at the field margins. Gleaning was not charity in the sense of a gift freely given. It was a recognized right, a formal feature of the agricultural system, a mechanism by which the community's most vulnerable members could participate in the harvest abundance at its margins. A good gleaning in a productive year could mean the difference between a household that ate adequately through the winter and one that did not. October brought the autumn plowing, the preparation of next year's winter field for sowing of wheat and rye that needed to go in before the ground hardened. The rhythm repeated. Oxen plow, cold mornings, the soil turning in its long furrows. Pigs were driven to the woodland for pannage, rooting for acorns and beechnuts in the fallen leaves. Fattening for the slaughter that would come when the cold was deep enough that the meat could be salted and stored without spoiling. The pre-winter slaughter of the animals that could not be sustained to the coming months was a significant event. The smell of it, the work of it, the sudden abundance of fresh meat that would quickly need to be preserved. Smoking and salting were the primary methods, and the results were varying in quality. The salt pork or salted mutton that kept the family through the lean months of February and March tasting strongly of its preservation in a way that fresh meat did not, and that people ate without complaint because the alternative was not eating. November and December slowed the year. The days shortened to the point where useful outdoor labor was confined to just a few hours of reasonable light, and the cold made sustained heavy work in the fields inadvisable and sometimes impossible. There was still work, always work. Tools to be repaired, thatch to be checked and replaced where the autumn rains had found weaknesses, wood to be split and stacked, animals to be tended through the long cold nights. But the quality of the labor shifted, became more domestic, turned inward toward the household and its immediate maintenance. Women spun to the winter evenings, the drop spindle turning in the firelight, producing the thread that would in time become the coarse cloth that clothed the family. There was leather work, basket work, the slow repair of the fabric of ordinary life that the more urgent seasons did not leave time for. And then January, the hardest month, when the stored food was drawing down faster than one would like, and the New Year's plowing was still weeks away. February, March, the ground softening again, the oxen brought from the winter pasture, leaner than they had been in autumn, their ribs showing to the rough winter coat, needing weeks of spring grass before they would be fully strong for the heavy work ahead. The circuit closed on itself and opened again and closed again, year after year for a working life that might span 30 or 40 years if the body held. Less if it did not. What this continuous cycle of heavy labor did to the human body is something that the archaeological record now speaks to with considerable specificity. Studies of skeletal remains from medieval English cemeteries, the quiet, patient work of physical anthropologists examining bones for evidence of what the bodies they belonged to had done and suffered during their lives, have produced a picture of the peasant body that is at once familiar and sobering. Osteoarthritis was nearly universal among adults, and it appeared early, often by the early 30s, affecting the spine, the hips, the knees, the hands. The specific patterns of skeletal stress visible in the bones reflect specific types of work. The repetitive bending of the harvest is readable in the lumbar vertebrae, the heavy pulling and pushing the plow in the shoulders and upper back. Dental wear was severe, partly because the coarse bread ground in stone mills contained fragments of the millstone itself, and a lifetime of eating bread with stone dust and it ground the teeth down in ways that are still visible 8 centuries later. Heel fractures were common. Arms, ribs, the small bones of the hand and foot, injuries from the ordinary accidents of physical labor with heavy animals and heavy tools and uneven ground. The bones tell a story of survival. Most of these people survived their injuries and returned to work because survival was what was required, and the body was remarkable in its capacity to return to function. But they returned carrying whatever the healing had cost them, and the accumulated cost of a working life left its record in bone. Thomas, at 32, would feel this in the ordinary way of feeling what one's body has become through use. His back aches in the morning and aches again at evening. His right knee, which he twisted badly 3 years ago during the harvest when he stumbled on wet ground with a full sheaf over his shoulder, has never quite returned to what it was before. His hands are capable and strong, but carry a specific stiffness in cold weather that requires some minutes of slow movement before the day's work can properly begin. None of this is dramatic. He does not think of himself as suffering in any particular way that distinguishes him from the men around him, all of whom carry their own catalog of small impairments and accommodations. It is simply the normal texture of a working body in a world where bodies work very hard for a very long time without rest commensurate to the labor. Agnes, for her part, carries her own history in her body. The bearing of children. She has been pregnant 5 times, of which 3 children lived past infancy and 2 did not, leaves its own marks. The carrying of heavy loads, the bending over the cooking fire, the carding and spinning that occupied the winter evenings and the spare minutes of every other season, the water carrying and the dairy work and the garden cultivation, and the gleaning and the harvest binding, and 100 other tasks that fell within the medieval conception of women's work. All of these are written in the same slow language of accumulated physical adaptation that the bones eventually speak to any one patient, enough to read them. Neither of them thinks of this as a tragedy. It is something else. The simple way of a life that is mostly labor, understood as such from childhood, accepted as a ground of existence in the way that one accepts the fact that days are short in winter and long in summer. Not happily or unhappily, but simply as the nature of things. The body works. The body endures. The body eventually does not. And in the meantime, one feeds one's children and tends one's crops and fulfills one's obligations and finds, in the margins of all this, whatever small satisfactions and pleasures the world makes available. We will get to those pleasures. They deserve their own time, their own attention, because they were real and they mattered, and any account of medieval peasant life that omits them is telling only part of the truth. But for now the year is turning again, the way it always turns, the plowing done and the sowing beginning, and the long green months of growing, and tending opening ahead of the village like a question that will not be answered until August delivers its verdict in grain. The sun is warmer than it was. The oxen are returning to strength. Thomas's son walks ahead of the team on his own strip with the goad held carefully in both hands, trying to keep the line straight, watching the ground ahead the way his father watches it, learning by watching, learning by doing, learning the way that knowledge of this kind has always been learned, in the body, in the field, in the slow turning of the seasons that will be the frame of his life as they have been the frame of his father's life and his grandfather's before him. The furrow opens. The soil turns. The year moves forward into whatever it is going to be. There's a building that still stands in the village of Bradford-on-Avon in Wiltshire, a long stone structure, its roof immense and steeply pitched, its interior dim and cool even in summer, smelling of old timber and dry air and something else that is harder to name, the ghost of a smell that is more memory than presence. It was built in the 14th century as a tithe barn, a place where the church's portion of the local harvest would be stored after collection, and it is large enough that you can stand at one end and have difficulty making out clearly what is at the other. This is not unusual. Tithe barns were built to hold a tenth of everything a large agricultural parish produced, and a large agricultural parish produced a great deal, and the building that was meant to contain a tenth of it had to be impressive almost by structural necessity. Thomas has never seen this particular barn. His world, as we have established, does not extend very far in any direction from the village where he was born, but he knows tithe barns. The one belonging to his parish church is smaller and made partly of timber rather than all of stone, and it sits behind the church building with the patient solidity of a thing that expects to be filled and emptied on a regular schedule, because that is what it is for and what it has always been for. Every year, When the harvest came in and the grain was threshed and the counting could be done, a tenth of it went to the church. Not approximately a tenth. A tenth. The calculation was watched carefully by the priest representative, and in cases of dispute about the count, it was rarely the farmer whose version prevailed. The tithe was not a new imposition in Thomas's era. It had been part of the institutional landscape of English Christianity for centuries, its origins traceable to biblical precedent that the medieval church inherited and formalized and enforced with the same administrative thoroughness it brought to everything else it managed. It covered grain, which was the obvious and primary item, but also wool and livestock, and in some parishes the smaller produce of gardens and orchards, and even, in certain interpretations, the eggs of hens and the honey of bees. The great tithe, as it was called, covered the major field crops. The small tithe extended to almost everything else. Together, they represented a not inconsiderable portion of what a villain household produced in the course of the year. It is worth pausing here to feel the arithmetic of Thomas's situation, not in any dry accountant's way, but in the lived sense of what it meant to a family working at the margins of sufficiency. Of everything his strips produced in a good year, roughly a tenth went to the church as tithe. Some portion of the remainder went to the Lord as rent, or was consumed by the labor services owed on the domain. Time spent working land that produced nothing for Thomas's household. Time that could otherwise have been spent on his own crops. Of what remained after that, some had to be set aside as seed corn for next year's planting, the non-negotiable investment in future production, without which there would be no next year at all. What was left, after all these prior claims had been satisfied, was what a family of four actually had to eat, to sell, to use for the small purchases that even the most self-sufficient household required. The tools that broke and needed replacing, the salt that could not be produced locally, the leather goods, and the occasional piece of iron that no medieval family could make for itself. In a good year, it worked. In a middling year, it worked with difficulty. In a bad year, it did not work at all, and the question of which claims would be deferred, and which would not become a question of acute human anxiety. The tithe and the Lord's dues did not easily defer. They had institutional weight behind them, the weight of the manor court, and the weight of the bishop's authority, and the weight of a system that had been collecting what it was owed long before Thomas was born, and would continue collecting long after he was gone. The tithe was collected in the name of the church, but the man who actually collected it, the man who appeared at the threshing floor and watched the grain being counted and carried the church's portion away, was sometimes the parish priest himself and sometimes a representative of whoever held the rectorial rights, which was a distinction that mattered in the complicated ecclesiastical geography of medieval England, but that we need not follow too far into its particularities here. What mattered to Thomas was the fact of collection, the standing presence of that entitlement at the moment when the harvest abundance was most visible, the tenth taken before the rest was secured. And then, with the grain that remained to him, he had to go to the mill. The Lord's mill stood at the bend in the stream below the village, where the water moved with enough force to turn the wheel, and it had stood there, or something like it had stood there, for as long as anyone in the village could trace. The mill was one of the most significant pieces of economic infrastructure in the medieval English village, and the fact that it belonged to the Lord was not incidental. The Lord held what was called the suit of mill, the right enforceable to the manor court, to require that the tenants of his manor grind their grain at his mill and nowhere else. Not at a mill in the next village, even if that mill was more convenient or more fairly operated. Not at a hand quern in one's own home, grinding slowly but at no monetary cost. Hand querns were, in many manners, explicitly prohibited for exactly this reason, because their use allowed tenants to bypass the toll. At the Lord's mill on the Lord's terms. The toll was typically expressed as a fraction of the grain brought for grinding, 1/16th, 1/24th, varying by manner and custom, taken directly from the measure. The miller keeping back a portion of the flour produced as payment for his services and the use of the equipment. This was a legitimate and expected arrangement. The problem was not the principle of the toll, but the practice of measuring it, which relied on the miller's honesty in ways that the structural situation did not encourage. The miller was the Lord's man, responsible to the Lord for the mill's operation, and the grain that passed through his hands each week represented the food supply of everyone in the village, passing through a single narrow point at which only one person could easily observe what was happening. The suspicion of millers, the dark reputation that clung to the trade across the whole of the medieval period and surfaces in literature and sermon and complaint with such regularity that it must reflect something real about the popular understanding of the occupation, was specifically the suspicion of false measures, of the thumb pressed down on the scale at the wrong moment, of a toll taken somewhat larger than the agreed fraction, a variance small enough that any individual farmer could not prove it with certainty, but large enough, aggregated across all the village's grain over the course of a year, to add up to a considerable personal advantage. Whether any particular miller was actually cheating in any systematic way is, as we said before, largely impossible now to determine. What the pervasiveness of the suspicion tells us is that people in this position, people who must pass the food supply through someone else's hands before they can eat it, notice the helplessness of that position and express their discomfort in the only way available when formal redress was difficult. They talked, and the talk became tradition, and the tradition became the type, and Chaucer's miller, that broad, loud, coarse figure on his horse, was recognized as familiar by every reader who had ever had to bring grain to a mill they did not own and wait while someone else held the measure. Beyond the tide and the mill, the manor court. We have met the court before as the institution to which village life was formally organized and recorded. But the court was also a revenue machine and collected that revenue in the currency of fines, and the list of finable offenses was long enough that navigating a year without appearing before at least once required a combination of careful behavior and good fortune that not everyone managed. A man was fined for allowing his pigs to damage his neighbor's grain. Another was fined for failing to maintain the section of ditch that was his responsibility to keep clear, with the result that the adjacent field had flooded. A woman was fined for brewing ale without paying the assize, the fee that covered the right to sell it, a fee that had to be paid each time and was enforced by the alitaster, a village official who had the pleasant professional obligation of sampling the ale being offered for sale and determining whether it met the required standard. Fines for the assize of ale appear so frequently in manor court records that they must be understood less as punishment for wrongdoing than as a kind of licensing fee, regularly paid by the women who brewed for sale as simply one of the costs of that trade. The word alewife, which appears in many records of the period, describes exactly this. A woman who kept and sold ale, often as a supplement to household income, operating out her home, and paying the assize as a matter of routine. Fines accumulated. Fines for straying animals. Fines for boundary disputes. Fines for failing to appear when summoned. Fines for infractions of the manor's agricultural regulations. The rule that no one could put more animals on the common than their stint allowed. The rule about the timing of the harvest. The rule about gleaning rights and when they could be exercised. The manor court was in some ways the closest thing the medieval village had to a formal regulatory body. And what it regulated by fining. This was not entirely unfair in the sense that the fines went into a common account that supported the lord's administration and, in theory, the maintenance of the infrastructure on which everyone depended. But the capacity of fine was also a form of power. Like all forms of power, it was subject to pressure of individual personalities and particular circumstances in ways that felt, from the receiving end, not always like justice. And yet the church, which took a tenth of everything Thomas produced, was also the institution that gave him Sunday. This deserves to sit for a moment, because Sunday in the medieval village was not quite what we might imagine from this distance. It was a day of rest in the sense that heavy agricultural labor was forbidden on the Sabbath, and the enforcement of this was real. The manor court quite willing to find a man caught reaping or carting on a Sunday, regardless of how urgent his personal harvest situation might be. But it was not rest in the modern sense of privacy and sleep. Sunday meant church, and church meant community, and community in a village of 30 households where everyone knew everyone else's business and had known it for their entire lives was an experience with a specific density to it, a weight of mutual familiarity that could be suffocating and sustaining in almost the same moment. The service was in Latin, which meant that the words being spoken by the priest at the altar were not understood by most of the congregation in any direct linguistic sense. This is true, and it has sometimes been taken to mean that the medieval peasant's experience of the Mass was therefore empty or alienated. But this understates what ritual can do when language steps aside. The Mass was a sensory experience as much as an intellectual one. The smell of incense, which was exotic and powerful in an era when most smells were the smells of animals and soil and wood smoke and human bodies. The lights of the east window falling across the altar at a particular hour in a particular season. The bell of the consecration. The familiar movement of the priest in his vestments. Actions performed in the same order and in the same way at every Mass, providing a structure so invariant that it was legible even to those who could not have explained it in words. For people whose lives were governed by the seasonality and unpredictability of agriculture, the absolute unchanging reliability of the liturgy was not a small thing. Here was something that was always the same. Here was something that did not fail. The priest himself was in many cases not a man of great learning or elevated character. The parish clergy of medieval England ranged widely, from the genuinely educated and devout to the barely literate and personally dissolute, with every variety between. Complaint literature of the period is full of dissatisfied observations about priests who neglected their duties, kept concubines, were drunk more often than pastoral care required, or could barely stumble through the Latin of the service they were supposed to be performing with devotion. Some of this is a genre. Complaint literature complains, because that is its nature, and it should not be taken as a portrait of the average. But it was real enough, common enough, that Thomas almost certainly knew priests of varying quality over the course of his life, and his relationship to the institution of the church was shaped partly by the particular man who stood at the altar in his village church, and partly by something larger and less personal than any individual man. The feast calendar was the church's gift to the year's rhythm, and it was considerable. The medieval liturgical year was structured around a cycle of feasts and fasts that gave almost every week some formal religious character, and some of those feast days were celebrated with freedom and an ease that the working week did not allow. Christmas, of course, and Easter, which were the great poles of the Christian year, but also the feast days of the patron saints of individual parishes, which were occasions for celebration specific to that community, a day when the village's particular saint was honored, and the ordinary obligations of labor were suspended, and something approaching festivity was possible. The number of such days varied by place and period, but across the medieval calendar, there were enough of them that their total represented a significant annual allowance of relief from work. Not always enough, not always well distributed through the year, but real. These were the holy days, the word from which we derive holiday, that etymology containing within it the whole story of what rest originally meant in a world where permission to rest had to come from somewhere above the individual's own preference. You did not rest because you chose to. You rested because the church had designated this day as sacred. And on sacred days, the fields could wait. The distinction matters because it meant that rest was not a luxury one could simply decide to take, but an institutional provision, granted rather than chosen, which put even the small mercy of a day off within the structure of obligation and dependency that surrounded everything else in a villain's life. In the alehouse, on the evening of a feast day, some of this complexity dissolved into something simpler and more immediate. The alehouse was not, in the 13th century, a formal tavern in anything like the modern sense. It was more likely a room in a house where a woman was selling ale she had brewed and where people gathered because gathering was something human beings do, and the alehouse was where you could do it without ceremony or obligation. The ale itself was not strong by modern standards, lower in alcohol than almost any commercial beer available now. But it was warm, it was social, and it represented a departure from the water that otherwise had to serve for all purposes of drinking. Strong ale existed but was for occasions, not every day. Ordinary ale was every day, practically safer than the water from sources that animals and humans use in common. The conversation in the alehouse carried everything the day contained. The morning sermon, already half translated into practical local terms by the communal process of discussion. The state of the fields, the dispute between two families over a boundary marker, the news that someone's cow had calved or someone's mother was ill, the slow, accumulated gossip of a community that shared everything, because privacy in a village of 30 households was a theoretical concept rather than a lived reality. There was music sometimes, or something that functioned as music, instruments of the kind that could be carried and played without much formal training. The fiddle, the bagpipe in its older and simpler forms, the drum. There was dancing at certain feasts, particularly the great festivals of midsummer and the turning of the agricultural year. Dances whose steps and forms had been performed on village green for generations long before any written record of them existed. Within all of this, the tithe barn and the manor court and the miller's toll. There lived a religious faith that was genuine and complex and not reducible to either simple piety or simple compliance. Thomas believed the nature of his belief, its specific texture and content, is something we can only approach obliquely from this distance, but the broad features are recoverable from what is known about popular religion in medieval England. He believed in God and in the saints and in the intercession of the Virgin, to whom the local church was probably dedicated. He believed in purgatory, which was not a minor piece of theology in this era, but an intensely practical matter, the place where the soul underwent its purification after death, a process that the prayers of the living could shorten, which made the commissioning of prayers for the dead a genuine act of love and a genuine financial consideration for the households of those who died. He believed in the calendar of the church as a frame within which time made sense, in the sacraments as real and necessary, in the Mass as the center around which everything else was organized. This faith did not make the tithe less heavy. It did not make the mill toll less resented or the manor court fines less sharp, but it provided a context in which suffering had a meaning and a location in a larger narrative, a story about human life and divine purpose that extended beyond the furrows of the spring field and the damp autumn of a poor harvest. It said that what a person endured here was not the whole story. It said that there was someone watching, which could be comforting or alarming depending on the moment and the state of one's conscience, but which was better than the alternative of a world that watched no one and cared about nothing. The tithe barn filled every autumn, and the church collected what it claimed, and the miller kept his fraction, and the manor court wrote its fines in its careful Latin, and the Sunday bell rang through the village from the stone tower that would outlast all of them. And on a feast day evening in October, with the harvest in and the cold still a few weeks away, Thomas sat in the alehouse with his neighbors and drank his ale, and the fire was warm, and someone was playing something on an instrument that no one had quite remembered the name for the record, and for a few hours the way of the year was set down somewhere just outside the door, and the room was full of the sound of people talking. Begin with bread, because bread is where almost everything begins. The bread that Thomas and Agnes ate was not the bread of later imagination, not the light, airy, pale crumb loaves that the word conjures for most people now. It was dark and dense and coarse, made from rye or a mixture of rye and wheat, or, in harder times, from whatever grain was available, and sometimes from things that were not quite grain at all, dried peas ground to flour, bean meal, the inner bark of certain trees in the worst of winters when more conventional sources had run out. It was heavy in the hand and heavy in the stomach, which was partly the point. A thick slice of it in the morning, perhaps with a small amount of hard cheese, or scraping a fat if the household ran to such things, was meant to fuel a body through hours of physical labor in coal fields, and in that specific functional sense it performed adequately. The pottage was the other constant. Every day, at almost every meal, the pot that hung above the fire contained some version of the same thing, a thick soup or porridge of grain and whatever vegetables the garden and the season provided. Peas and beans were essential. They were among the few sources of protein reliably available to villain households, and their importance in the medieval diet cannot be overstated. Onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, the herbs that grew in the kitchen garden behind the house. All of these went into the pot in their season, adding flavor and nutrition to what would otherwise have been a monotonous staple. In summer, the pottage could be quite good. Fresh vegetables, green herbs, the dairy produce of season when the cows were milking well, all of it producing something that a hungry person could find genuinely satisfying. In February, the pottage was whatever had survived the winter in storage, the turnips softening at the bottom of the pile, the dried peas that had been boiled and reboiled until they lost their individual shape and merged into a gray-green mass that provided sustenance and very little else. Meat was occasional. The great pre-winter slaughter provided salt pork and salt mutton, and whatever else the household had decided could not be fed through spring, and this preserved meat was a winter resource. Eaten sparingly because it had to last, and because the salting process, though effective at preservation, gave a result of flavor and a texture quite unlike fresh meat. In summer, small game might supplement the diet, rabbits and birds and eels from the stream, and chickens provided eggs through productive months of the year, though the chickens themselves were more valuable alive and laying than killed for a single meal. Pigeons from the Lord's dovecot were available to the Lord and his household. They were not available to Thomas, whose only relationship to the dovecot was the occasional sight of it on the rise near the manor house, and the awareness that it represented a food source he did not have access to, one that moreover consumed grain found in the village fields, a fact that generated a slow, steady resentment rarely expressed anywhere except in private. What this diet looked like in nutritional terms, what it provided and what it lacked, is something that later scholarship has been able to examine with some care. The medieval peasant diet, in a reasonable year, provided adequate calories through its heavy emphasis on grains and legumes. It was likely deficient in certain vitamins, particularly in winter when fresh vegetables were scarce, and a low intake of animal protein and fat affected how the body handled the considerable physical demands placed on it. Vitamin D deficiency, in a northern country with limited sunshine for much of the year, and indoor work for much of the day, produced the bone softening and skeletal deformity of rickets at a rate that the archaeological record confirms was significant. Iron deficiency was common, particularly among women of childbearing age, whose dietary needs in this regard went unmet by a diet that provided iron primarily in its less bioavailable plant form. In bad years or in households that were on the wrong side of the village's internal distributions of resource and luck, the diet was not merely nutritionally incomplete, but simply insufficient in calories. Not enough food. Full stop. Hunger as a chronic condition, a persistent low-grade insufficiency, rather than the dramatic acute starvation of disaster, was part of the background experience of peasant life in ways that are difficult to reconstruct from the outside. People habituate to chronic shortage in ways that make it invisible in the historical record. No one writes a letter saying they are slightly hungry most of the time, partly because no one in this period is writing letters at all, and partly because slight hunger was so unremarkable a condition that it would not have occurred to anyone to record it. What the record does show, in skeletal remains and in the indirect evidence of body size, medieval peasants were, on average, several centimeters shorter than their modern equivalents, a difference attributable substantially to nutrition in childhood. Is a population whose physical development was constrained by what it was able to eat. Against this backdrop of chronic scarcity, a bad harvest was not merely an inconvenience, but crisis with direct consequences for human survival. And in the years between 1315 and 1322, what descended on England and on much of northern Europe was not a single bad harvest, but a sequence of them so prolonged and so severe that it has been called, by historians writing many centuries later, the Great Famine, a name that captures something of its scale, if not its particular texture, as it was actually lived. The summer of 1315 was wet. Not unusually wet in any single week, perhaps, but persistently, incessantly wet across the crucial months of June and July and August, the rain falling on grain that was trying to ripen and preventing it from doing so, the grain on the stalk rotting rather than drying, the harvest that finally came in pale and thin and damp and far short of what the previous autumn's planting had suggested it might be. The lords reduced their stores, and so did the villages, and so did individual households, drawing down reserves that in a normal year would have been adequate to bridge the gap until next summer's harvest. They did so with the assumption that next summer would be better. Next summer was not better. The summer of 1316 was, if anything, worse. The harvest of that year failed across most of England and across a vast swath of the continent, from Ireland in the west to Poland in the east, failing not uniformly, but failing everywhere in the sense that nowhere produced what it had in better years. Grain prices, already high from the previous year's shortage, rose to levels that placed basic food beyond the reach of the poor. Livestock died of the same wet conditions that ruined the grain, and of disease that spread through weakened herds. Murrain swept through cattle and sheep populations across England in these years, removing at a stroke the animals that represented both a food source and a capital investment for the households that owned them. A villain family that entered the famine with a cow and a few sheep and emerged from it with neither had lost not only the immediate food value of those animals, but the possibility of recovery, the future milk and wool, and offspring that would have provided the margin of sufficiency in the years ahead. People died. Not in the dramatic, concentrated way of later catastrophes, but in the slow, distributed way of starvation-related mortality. People already weakened by months of insufficient food, succumbing to illnesses that a well-fed body might have resisted. Infants and the elderly going first, the ordinary diseases of the period carrying a higher death toll than usual through a population whose immune systems and physical resilience had been worn down by hunger. The Great Famine is estimated to have killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe over the 7 or so years of its worst duration, numbers that historians have arrived at through patient reconstruction from fragmentary evidence, and whose precision should be held lightly, but whose general magnitude gives some sense of what happened to communities like Thomas's grandfathers in those years. We do not have a name for what Thomas's grandfather experienced in those years, if he experienced them at all. The arithmetic of generations makes it plausible but uncertain. What we can say is that the memory of famine, the specific fear that the harvest might fail and the food might run out before the year did, was not an abstraction to medieval English village but a lived inheritance. Something passed down to the generations in the form of certain behaviors and certain anxieties that shaped how people related to their stored grain and their seed corn and the condition of the fields in a wet June. And then, a generation later, something arrived that was different in kind from anything that had come before. It came from the East, or so the understanding of the time had it, though the specific geography of its origin was murky to those who first experienced it in England. It came through trade routes and along coastlines and into ports and then inland to the ordinary movement of people and goods, and it arrived in the south of England in the late summer and early autumn of 1348. And within 2 years it had traveled the length of the country, and the shape of English life was permanently different. The Black Death, as it has been known since the 16th century, those who lived through it did not have this name for it. They had other names: the Great Pestilence, the Great Mortality, names that reached the scale of what was happening without quite being able to hold it, was almost certainly caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, and its variants, though this understanding arrived many centuries after the events themselves and was not available to anyone who tried to make sense of what was happening in 1348 from the inside. What they knew was this: people became ill very suddenly, with fever and with a terrible pain in the lymph nodes of the groin and armpits and neck, and large, dark swellings appear at those points, the buboes that gave bubonic plague its name. And within days, or sometimes within hours of the first symptoms appearing, many of the sick were dead. The speed was what made it unlike anything in the ordinary experience of illness. Medieval people were not strangers to death. Infant mortality alone had ensured that, but the diseases they knew best killed slowly enough that the process had a recognizable shape. The illness, the watching, the prayers, the gradual determination of whether recovery was going to happen or not. The plague killed so fast that the shape collapsed. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall, and the speed meant that the rituals surrounding death, the last rites, the farewell, the preparation, and the burial in the churchyard with the proper prayers said over the grave, could not always be observed, because there was not always time, and because the priest himself might be sick, and because the number of dead in a bad week was more than the ordinary mechanisms of burial could manage. How many died? This is a question that historians have spent a great deal of careful effort trying to answer, and the honest answer is that the sources do not allow a precise figure for England or for any part of it. But the range of estimates that serious scholarship has converged on suggests somewhere between a third and a half of England's population died in the initial outbreak of 1348 to 1350, with additional smaller waves of plague recurring through the following decades. A third to a half. This is not a statistic that can be made to feel what it actually was by staring at the numbers themselves. It has to be translated into the specific, the local, the human. A village of 30 households in 1347 might be a village of 15 or 18 households in 1350. Some of those missing households would have been entirely extinguished, every member gone, the house standing empty, the strips in the open fields unclaimed, the animals dispersed. Some households would have lost one adult and retained the others, or lost a parent and retained the children, or survived intact while their nearest neighbors did not. The pattern of survival was not rational in any way that allowed prediction or preparation. It was, to those inside it, simply what happened, falling where it fell, and the absence of any comprehensible logic to who survived and who did not was itself a part of what made it so devastating to make sense of. The priest buried his parishioners, and some of those priests died too, and new priests had to be found, and they were not always as qualified as those they replaced, because the pool of available clergy shrank along with everything else. Lords died alongside their serfs, which was a reminder, unusual in the medieval world, that the hierarchy of obligation that normally structured every interaction between classes was suspended by this particular emergency. which did not consult the legal status of its victims before selecting them. Monks died in their monasteries and nuns in their convents, and the learned men in their cathedral schools, and the loss of trained administrative personnel. The clerks and record keepers and financial managers who kept the institutional apparatus of church and manor functioning was a practical blow to the systems of governance that did not recover quickly. For Thomas's generation, he is not yet born in 1348, but this is his parents' world, his grandparents' world, the catastrophe that shaped the specific village he will grow up in. The plague was an experience that defied the normal categories of understanding available to a medieval Christian mind. God permitted suffering. This was understood and accepted. God permitted suffering as punishment for sin, or as a test, or as a mystery that would be clarified only in the hereafter. All of this a theology could hold. But suffering at this scale, death at this speed, the complete non-selectivity of it, the pious dying alongside the wicked, the young alongside the old, the children who had barely arrived in the world alongside the grandparents who had spent their whole lives in it, strain the categories in ways that produce a range of responses from intensified religious devotion to something approaching its opposite, a kind of desperate carelessness born of the feeling that nothing in the ordinary structure of cause and effect was operating in a way that made normal moral calculations relevant. The village that Thomas grows up in carries the plague within its physical fabric in ways that are visible if you know how to look. There are gaps in settlement, plots where houses once stood but were not rebuilt, perhaps because no family survived to claim them, perhaps because the demographic losses made them unnecessary. There are strips in the open fields that have fallen out of cultivation, reverting to rough grass, because there are not enough people to work all the land that the pre-plague population had maintained. There are new names in the old family holdings, as survivors married the widows and widowers of those who died, and absorbed neighboring strips into larger personal holdings that the pre-plague legal structures had not quite anticipated. And there is a subtler change, one that will unfold over the decades following the plague in ways that the people of Thomas's time could not quite articulate, but could feel in the altered quality of certain negotiations, certain interactions between lord and tenant that had always, before, run in a single direction. We will return to this. But first, the children. Because any account of what it was like to live a life in medieval England that does not spend time with what happened to children is not telling the whole story. Infant mortality in the medieval period was severe. The best estimates historians have been able to construct from the fragmentary evidence available suggest that somewhere between a fifth and a third of all children born in medieval England died before reaching their first year. By age 5, the cumulative losses were higher still. Agnes has been pregnant 5 times. 3 of her children lived to the age of attending the harvest, to the age of walking behind the ox team of the goad, to the age of being someone their mother could see growing into a person with a specific character and particular ways. 2 did not. The 2 who did not have not been discussed in the hours we have spent with this family, because they were not discussed much by the family either. Not because the loss was not felt, but because it was so common a loss that the framework for speaking about it was not quite what would be in a later era, when child death had become unusual enough to be individually remarkable. There were prayers said, and a baptism that had happened quickly after the first birth, because getting a child out of an unchristened state was urgent. Dying unchristened meant dying outside the possibility of heaven, or so the theology of the period held. And the fear of this produced a practice of immediate baptism that was one of the few real urgencies in a community where most things moved slowly. The priest had come, and the water had been poured, and the name had been given. And then, within a few weeks in one case and a few months in the other, the child had died and had been buried in the churchyard in a small grave that Agnes still sometimes pauses near on her way in or out of the Sunday service. This is not tragedy in the sense of something unusual. It is the ordinary grief of a world in which the boundary between life and death was much closer to the beginning of life than anything most people reading this have experienced. It shaped how people related to their children in ways that are sometimes misunderstood as coldness. The argument, made by some historians and contested by others, that medieval parents were psychologically guarded toward their young children because the expected loss made full emotional investment in a specific infant a kind of risk management problem. The evidence for this is mixed, and the counter-evidence, the tender references to children in the literature of the period, the presence of toys in archaeological contexts, the obvious anguish expressed in records of sudden child death, suggests that the picture is more complicated than any single characterization allows. People loved their children, and people lost their children, and people found ways of holding both things at once, which is what grief requires. The body itself, over the course of a life lived as Thomas and Agnes lived theirs, accumulated its own quiet history of illness and recovery and partial recovery, and the things that did not quite recover. There were no hospitals in the modern sense available to people of their station. There was the herb knowledge of the community, held primarily by women who had learned it from the women before them and would pass it on to the women after. The specific plants that were held to help with specific conditions, the knowledge of which mold from which bread might help an infected wound, the management of childbirth through accumulated experience in the absence of anything like formal obstetric knowledge. Some of this worked, in the sense that human bodies are remarkably good at healing themselves when given minimal assistance and time. Some of it did not. The line between the two was not always clear, and the attribution of recovery to the herb or the prayer or simply the body's own resources was not something the evidence could settle. The ailments were familiar and permanent. The chest troubles that came with winter damp and the smoke of the central hearth, and never quite resolved before the next winter came. The toothaches that progressed, in a world with no dentistry, until they became something more serious and occasionally fatal. The wound from tools and animals and the ordinary accidents of farm life that sometimes healed cleanly and sometimes did not. The childbirth complications that killed women with a regularity that was unremarkable only because it was so consistent that it had become part of the expected landscape of a woman's life. The knowledge that each pregnancy carried this risk, not mentioned much, because mentioning it did not change it, and because there were other things to attend to. Outside the cottage door, the evening is coming quietly over fields. The light that remains is the soft, horizontal light of a late afternoon in autumn, falling across the stubble of the harvested strips in long gold lines, picking out the ridge and furrow in relief, so that the whole field seems suddenly three-dimensional in a way the flat noonlight does not allow. A crow moves along the far tree line. The smoke from the village's chimneys is thickened with the cooking fires of supper, and the smell of it drifts down to where Thomas is finishing the last of the day's work. He is tired. He is always, in some sense, tired, in the way that a body that works every day develops a baseline of tiredness that becomes a normal condition rather than a notable exception. But the harvest is in. The grain is in the barn. The worst of the year's uncertainty has resolved into something concrete and countable, and the outcome, this year, is adequate, not abundant. Adequate. He straightens up slowly, with a familiar protest on the lower back that he has long since stopped attending to as information, and has incorporated instead as simple punctuation, the body's habitual comment on the end of a working day. The field stretches out behind him in the fading light. The village is visible ahead, its rooftops low against the sky, its chimneys sending up their separate signals of shelter. He walks home across the stubble, and the light goes with him, and the day closes around what it has been. There is a moment that arrives in summer, in the long evenings between the end of the day's work and the dark that finally calls everyone inside, when the village green has a quality that is difficult to name, but immediately recognizable if you have ever sat in a field in the late afternoon and felt the particular stillness of a day that is winding down without one in a hurry. The air is warm and still carries the smell of the cut grass and the morning's haymaking, and the light has gone golden and long, lying across the common in thick horizontal bands that make everything it touches seem both more fully itself and somehow more still than it was at noon. Children are playing at the far edge of the green in a game that has rules understood among themselves, the rules occasionally in dispute, the dispute resolved with the pragmatic speed of children who have other things to get back to. A dog lies stretched in the last of sun. Someone is sitting in the doorway of the house that faces the green, not doing anything in particular, which is itself a rare enough occurrence that it has the quality of a small gift. Thomas is here, or someone very like him. Let's hold him lightly now, as a figure rather than a name, because we are approaching the end of the day and the end of the story, and the particular intimacy of the individual is giving way to something a little wider, a little more diffuse, the way vision does when the eyes relax, and the middle distance becomes a place where everything gathers. What the life contained inside all its obligations and its hardship and its chronic physical difficulty was not nothing. This needs to be said plainly, not as a consolation or a softening of what came before, but as something separately true. The friendship that ran between neighbors who had known each other since childhood and whose children knew each other and whose parents had known each other before any of them were born. This was real, and it had a specific warmth that is perhaps only fully available in communities small enough that every face is familiar, every voice recognizable, every mood readable from 50 feet. The loyalty was real. The love was real. Agnes, who had been Thomas's wife for 12 years by the time we find him on that February morning, was not simply a domestic arrangement. They had chosen each other, in the imperfect sense available to young people in a medieval village, where the choosing happened within limits set by family expectation and economic practicality, but where within those limits something that genuinely resembled choice was exercised, and where the result, in many cases, was a partnership of real depth built on shared labor and shared loss and the accumulation of daily knowing that comes from spending most of one's waking hours in the same small space with the same person. He knew the way she moved in the garden in the mornings, the particular efficiency of her hands among the plants, the way she talked to the things she was tending in the absent, half-audible murmur that people use when they are not quite speaking to themselves and not quite speaking to anyone else. She knew the sound of his footstep and could distinguish it from every other footstep in the village when she heard it coming up the path. These things are not remarkable. They are simply the intimate knowledge of long proximity, the specific texture of a shared life. They are also, in a world with very little private space and very little time not claimed by labor or obligation, something close to a refuge. The feast days carried their own particular gravity. Not only the great feasts of Christmas and Easter, which had a profound religious weight in their particular rituals, but the smaller ones, the feast of the village's patron saint, which was a day when the community turned to face itself, when the ordinary hierarchies relaxed slightly and the shared identity of the place. This village, the specific gathering of households that had worked the same land together for generations, became briefly visible as something that had its own dignity and its own shape. There was food at these occasions, better food than ordinary days allowed. Roasted meat at the season and the circumstances permitted, and the better ale held back for celebration rather than drunk through the ordinary week. There was music. There was dancing on the green in the long summer evenings, the kind of dancing that did not require instruction, but only a knowledge of the steps that had been danced by the same community on the same occasion for longer than anyone could trace. The pattern carried in the body rather than the mind, passed from parent to child the way the knowledge of the fields was passed, not through any formal teaching, but through the simple fact of watching and doing, season after season, until the knowledge became something physical, something the feet simply knew. People who had worked from before dawn for 6 days found, on a feast evening, that their bodies could still do this, could still move in the warm air to the sound of the fiddle, could still find the particular pleasure of coordinated motion with other people, the pleasure that is physical and social in the same moment and requires no interpretation. Children too young to understand the occasion danced because the adults were dancing and the music was there. Older people who could no longer manage a full figure stood at the edge and moved within whatever smaller range was still available to them. And this was enough, and this was its own thing. The alehouse, through all of it, was where the social life of the village found its most regular expression. Not every night. Ale cost money, and money was always scarce. But on the evenings after a feast day, on the evenings after the major agricultural milestones that marked the year, and on ordinary evenings when the day's work was done, and the warmth of sitting indoors with other people was worth the small expenditure, the conversation there was not elevated in any sense that a visitor from outside might have recognized as such. It was a conversation of people talking about the things directly in front of them. The state of the fields, the behavior of the reeve, the progress of the neighbor's illness, the marriage being negotiated between two families at the village's edge, the surprising quality of the season's ale, old stories, worn smooth by retelling, complaints, laughter, the specific kind that communities produce when they have known each other long enough that the shared reference can be abbreviated to almost nothing and still land exactly where it was aimed. And sometimes late in the evening, when the fire had burned low and the children who had been brought along had fallen asleep against their parents' sides, the conversation moved toward other things, toward the question of why the world was arranged as it was, and whether it had always been exactly so, and whether it might someday be otherwise. The world was changing slowly in ways that Thomas's generation could feel without being quite able to articulate. The plague had done something to the balance between the village and the manor that no lord's decree had entirely managed to undo. when a third or more of the population died within the space of a few terrible years. The labor that remained became precious in a way it had not been when there was always more of it than the land required. Lords who had previously set terms and had those terms met, who had fined and demanded and taken with the confidence of men whose positions seemed unchallengeable, found themselves in the unfamiliar position of needing their tenants more than they had before. The serf who could not leave the manor without permission was, in the generation after the plague, a serf who understood something that the generation before had not quite had occasion to understand so clearly, that the Lord needed him to stay. Wages for agricultural labor edged upward in the decades after the plague, not uniformly and not without resistance. The Statute of Laborers, issued shortly after the initial outbreak, attempted to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels, recognizing the danger to the established order situation in which working people had more options than they had previously possessed. The statute was imperfectly enforced, as laws tend to be when the economic forces running against them are strong enough. Landlords who needed workers paid what the situation required, quietly, in a particular way that people manage when the official position and the practical necessity have diverged too far to pretend otherwise. In some part of England, villein families began to negotiate the commutation of their labor services for money rents, an exchange that acknowledged the old obligation without requiring its physical performance, a shift that suited both parties in a world where the domain was contracting and the old arrangements were becoming something that neither side was entirely sure how to maintain. Thomas's position was not dramatically different from his grandfather's in its formal structure. The manor court still met. The Harriet was still claimed at death. The legal status of villeinage had not been swept away by the losses of the plague, but the texture of the thing had shifted, in the way that a long relationship shifts when one party's position changes without the formal terms having been renegotiated. He was not free, but freedom, in whatever form it might eventually take, was not quite the impossible abstraction it had been to the generations before him. And then, in the summer of 1381, something happened in Kent and Essex and in the city of London. News of it reached villages like Thomas's slowly, carried by traveling traders and peddlers and itinerant workers, passing from mouth to mouth along the roads, arriving already transformed by the distance it traveled, its edges worn smooth, and its most remarkable elements perhaps enlarged in the telling. What arrived was something like this: that working people, villagers, craftsmen, men and women of exactly the kind that filled the landscape Thomas knew, had risen, that they had marched, that they had gone to London and spoken with the king himself, the young Richard, barely into his teens, who had ridden out to meet them, and that promises had been made, or something that sounded like promises, in the extraordinary circumstances of that summer week. John Ball was one of the names that traveled along with the story. A priest who had preached for years the kind of sermon that the institutional church did not encourage. A sermon about the fundamental equality of all persons before God, about the question of where lordship came from, if you followed it back to its origins, about what stood before the arrangements that structured every medieval village, in the time before those arrangements had been put in place. The verse attributed to him, the old couple about Adam delving and Eve spinning, about who was a gentleman in that first garden before rank and obligation had been invented by men and imposed on other men, was exactly the kind of question that the alehouse conversations sometimes approached late in the evening and then, usually, retreated from, because the arriving somewhere definite was dangerous, and everyone present knew it, and the fire was warm, and there was still ale. The revolt was suppressed. Wat Tyler, its most visible leader, was killed at Smithfield. The promises that had been made were retracted. The order that had been challenged was restored to something close to what had been before, at least in its visible form. And yet the revolt was not nothing, and everyone who heard about it knew it was not nothing. Something had been said publicly, and at great personal cost by the people who said it. Something about what the world was and what it might be asked to become. Something that was now part of the story that traveled the roads and sat in the alehouse and was turned over in the minds of people in villages that had never seen the inside of London. Thomas would have heard what he thought. Sitting with his neighbors in the low firelight of the alehouse with the story fresh in the room is not preserved in any record we have. The record does not reach that far inside. But the period that followed the revolt did shift, and slowly, and in the direction that those who marched had pointed, and the shift was legible in manor court rolls and in the changed frequency of commutation agreements, and in the gradual loosening, unevenly across the country, and over many decades, of the most rigid features of the system that had enclosed a life like Thomas's from birth. The change was slow. It was not the clean transformation that any single summer could deliver. Change of the kind that reshapes a social order takes generations and requires forces more various and more prosaic than any single act of collective defiance. Economic forces and demographic forces, and the accumulated weight of individual negotiations, small concessions, the quiet decisions of people who decided one by one, and in no coordinated way that the terms of their condition were shifting and that they would shift with them. But this is further ahead than the evening allows us to see. The village is still here. Let us return to it now. The light that falls across the fields in the late afternoon of an October day has a quality specific to that season and that hour. Warm still, warmer than the morning had suggested it would be, but with thinness to it, a transparency, as if the air itself is beginning the slow process of letting go of what the year has held. The stubble in the harvested fields catches this light along the top of each cut stem, so that the whole field has a low, golden shimmer, as if it is still producing something, still offering something upward, even now that the serious work of the year is done. The smoke is rising from the rooftops, the same smoke it has always been, from the same low thatch, carrying the smell of the evening fires upward into the cooling air, dispersing slowly into a sky that is still pale in the west and beginning to darken in the east. The church tower stands at the edge of the village in its stone patience. The stream runs below, where it has always run, where it ran before the village was here, and will run in a time when what we have been describing is so thoroughly past that it will require the work of scholars to recover even its outline. The mill wheel turns slowly in the current, moved not by any urgency at this late hour, but simply by the persistence of the water, which does not stop because the day is ending. Thomas is walking home across the field, or someone very like him is. His son is ahead, taller than he was in the spring, still carrying the goad he used with the ox team this morning, swinging it easily as young people carry things when the work is over and the body still has somewhere to be. The dog moves behind them both, nose working to the stubble, attending to its own separate reckoning with what the day has left behind. The village receives them the way it has always received them, with its smoke and its familiar sounds, the voices of neighbors, the complaint of the gate, the low conversation of animals settling for the night. Nothing here is extraordinary. Everything here is what it has always been, which is its own kind of extraordinary if you can stand still enough to feel it. The persistence of ordinary things, the way a community continues to be itself through everything that moves through it and changes it and is eventually absorbed into it. The boy reaches a house first and pushes open the door, and the warmth and the smell of the evening fire come out to meet him. Thomas pauses for a moment on the threshold, the way he has always paused, face turned back toward the fields and the last of the light, lying across them in long lines that are already beginning to fail. The year has been adequate. The family has eaten. The children are alive and growing and learning the things they will need to know. The obligations are met and the grain is in the barn and somewhere in the accumulated weight of ordinary days, in the plowing and the sowing and the slow harvest and the fire rebuilt each morning. The world is changing the way that worlds change, not all at once and not with any clarity in the moment, but grain by grain, season by season, the same steady process as the soil that receives a plow and opens and then closes again, and in the opening is made ready for whatever comes next. The light goes from the field. The door closes. The smoke from the low rooftops rises, straight and steady, into the darkening sky, and the village settles into its evening, and the stream runs on below, and the great wheel of the year turns on its quiet axis toward whatever it is going to be. This is where we leave them. If this slow walk through another world helped you rest tonight, a like or subscription is a quiet way to let the channel know you were here.